even is this thing? I do not know, but I am going to eat it, that's for sure. Squash! You love to grow them because they're easy to grow, but then what do you do with them? So many people grow them and then they just give them away. And people like me, I take them. Why? Because you can eat them and they're so good. Okay, first rule. If you can pierce it with your fingernail, you can eat the peel. Mind blown yet? Now wait for it. Wait for it. Here it comes. Wait for it. I'm going to squash everything you think you know about squash and how to cook it. Stay tuned. Wait for it. Are you waiting? Are you waiting? Now I'm just making you wait. Okay. Pumpkin. Observe. Pierced. You can eat the pumpkin skin. Walk with me. Let's do this.
So in this video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I prepare squash. The first is just using it as a dinner veggie. So here I am scooping out the seeds, and then we are going to just chop them up. I think sometimes people find squash a little bit intimidating because they're such a big vegetable and they're only around in the fall. So no one's totally fluent in squash because it's not really a year-round thing. Next, we're going to cut the pumpkin. We're going to knock the stem right off of it like that. And that gives us an easy, vulnerable spot to put the knife in so we can just cut the squash in half really quite easily. Next, you'll see I make a cut with the spoon at the top and the bottom of the squash. And this makes it much easier to actually scoop out the seeds because they're really only attached firmly in a couple of spots. The rest you can just kind of scrape away with the spoon. You'll also notice that when I take out the pulp here, I'm going to put it all in a bowl. And the reason I do that is because I save the seeds. Any type of squash you can save the seeds from and roast them and use them as a fat or a protein. And I'll show you how to do that a little later in the video. Right now, we're just dicing it up into bite-sized pieces. So first I'm cutting them into rings, and then I'm just slicing up the rings. I slice them into about the kind of chunks you would do if you were cutting up a cantaloupe for eating, just kind of those like 1-inch cubes. And then I put it on a parchment-lined cookie sheet. And the reason I use parchment is otherwise it caramelizes and kind of fuses to the pan. So it's really helpful to use parchment paper, and then you don't need to use any grease. I genuinely feel like pumpkin is just such a generous vegetable. Like you plant one seed and you get this huge vining plant with a whole bunch of fruits on it. I don't know, it's such a generous vegetable. And anywhere where the stem touches down to the ground, it can actually set down roots again. I don't know if you knew that. So that's why one pumpkin plant can be sprawling over an entire field. It's pretty cool. And all those seeds that we save for roasting, we can also save for seed planting next year. All right, so you notice my squash is very crowded here. We like to have it in a single layer. So what I'm gonna do is scoop some off and put it on a separate sheet pan. And that way we can have it all in a single layer. My oven has convection, so I will be able to roast these at the same time, 425 degrees for 15 minutes. And then we take a little scraper and just scoop it all around, give it all a good stir. We're gonna rotate those pans and we're gonna put them back in the oven, still at 425 for another 20 minutes this time. And that's it for how to roast squash to use as a dinner veggie. Now I like to let this cool off and then I portion it out. I weigh it out into the amounts that I want. At dinner time, I eat 6 ounces of hot veggie and 6 ounces of salad. So that's what I've portioned out here, and I got a full 7 days worth. Here it is with my weenie roast we had with our family. I had my squash and my salad and my smokies. All right, phase 2 of pumpkins with a new haircut. We're gonna cut them open again. Notice we stick the knife in the top in the soft spot where the stem used to be, and then we cut away from ourselves. So we're never cutting towards our hands. Trust me, I have sliced off enough fingertips that this is a little tidbit of advice that's worth listening to. With these pumpkins, I'm gonna show you how I harvest and roast the seeds. So you'll notice the first thing I do when I'm scooping out the insides is I cut at the top and the bottom because that is where it's actually firmly attached. Then the rest just scrapes out really easy. It's just fine little veins that are holding it in place there, and so it just scrapes out really easily. I'm scooping it all out and I'm putting the pumpkins themselves onto a sheet pan for later. We're gonna make some pumpkin puree with the rest of the pumpkins. And yes, we're gonna use those skins in the puree. All right, so all I'm doing is massaging the pulp until all the mature seeds come out. There's always a few little baby seeds. I don't take those ones out because there's nothing in them. They're just shell. So you gotta massage, you gotta work it around. There's always some hiding in a different layer. You gotta almost turn it like the pages of a book. There are different layers of veining to get through. And so I just stick it all in the bowl. And yes, there's always a few little bits of pulp that make it in there too, but I just pick those out as I go. Also, if you didn't know this, a lot of people have kind of an intolerance to the enzyme that's in raw squash. What can happen is when you work with it afterwards, your hands feel like the skin is too tight, or it feels raw, or it almost looks like there's a layer of skin peeling off. So I avoid having this by, when I work with squash, I always wash my hands off with soap and water while that enzyme is still wet. Don't let it dry to your skin. So the whole time I'm working with this, my hands are wet. Now we're rinsing off these seeds. You notice I already rinsed my hands once. Rinse off the seeds real good in a strainer, pulling out and picking out little bits of pulp that are in there, like I said I would. Wash, 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 and somewhere in between there, I have washed my hands with soap and water. Now I lay them all out in a towel, and I wrap the towel around them, and I'm gonna wring them out like a set of wet hair. I just twist it and wring it out real good, and that just helps get some of the water off the seeds. Next, I'm gonna actually just roast them dry. If you don't wanna do this step, you can skip this step by just leaving them on the towel for like an hour. But I stick them in the oven wet at 200 degrees and give them a solid 20 minutes to just dry out, because I'm impatient. I don't wanna wait 2 hours. I wanted to get these done so I could use them for my lunch fat. There we go, they're dry. So now we just add some butter. So fair warning, I only use these as a fat because I do add fat to them. I don't use these as a protein. They have more fat than a protein ought to have. And if you're fully dairy-free, you're welcome to use avocado oil, olive oil, any oil will work. And I just popped it in the oven just to make sure the fat would melt. And then I just stir that into the seeds. I do not add any spices to mine. I find that just the butter and a bit of salt is all the flavor these guys need, especially because they're from a fresh pumpkin. Spread them out once you've got the oil or butter all mixed in, and then back at 200 for another 20 minutes. Now I'm pulling them out. I'm going to give them a stir and a bit of salt. So I don't actually measure the butter I put in here because a ½ ounce of seeds or a ½ ounce of butter both count as a fat serving. So there's really just no point. I just add a dollop, and I know that ½ ounce of this stuff on the pan is going to be a fat serving. It's pretty neutral. Right now I'm raising the oven temperature to 300 for another 20 minutes. And that way they get a nice browning to them, and they kind of puff up a little bit, and it makes them crunchy. So if you ever had store-bought pumpkin seeds, you'll know the shells are really woody. Fresh pumpkin seeds are not woody like that. You can crunch into these and you bite right through them. There's none of this fibrous stringiness to them. It's amazing. These in the fridge so that they're nice and fresh every time I need them. Okay, let's move on to the pumpkin. We are gonna roast this to use for pumpkin puree. So you'll notice I'm just cutting it into pretty big chunks. It doesn't need to be in teeny little bite-sized pieces. So we're just hacking up the pumpkin. Again, it doesn't quite fit on one layer. So I pull out a second sheet pan and I stick some on there. I'd rather have them more spaced out than crowded. If they're too crowded, what happens is it gets really watery on the pan and they don't really roast properly. You don't get that nice browning and caramelization that's, so distinct to a roasted vegetable. So we did 20 minutes and then we rotated the pans, and we're doing another 20 minutes. And that was at 400 degrees for the roasting. So these have had 40 minutes at 400 degrees. And this is how you know they're done. They pass the shmoosh test. Here you go in slow motion. Smoosh, smoosh, smoosh. Yep, everything is done. All right, so all we do is stick it in the blender or food processor. This is the Vitamix blender. It comes with a tamper, which is like a special stick so you can smush your food down. Do not use a spatula. You will blend your spatula. So yeah, food processor or blender. You can add a teeny bit of water to make it emulsify a little better. And there you go. It's a nice thick puree. I use this in any recipe that calls for canned pumpkin puree, and it works really well. You'll notice I'm blending it up, skin and all. And that gives it that nice dark orange color. It's not yellow, it's actually orange like it's supposed to be. At this point, we just wash, rinse, repeat. We're sticking in the chunks of cooked pumpkin. We are tamping it down and blending it up. And we're doing it again and again and again. Notice the pattern. And I just take a little bit of water so I can scrape off the little caramelized bits, and then the very last batch of pumpkin, I just put in that water from the pans. So in my food addiction recovery program, we do not puree fruit, but we can puree vegetables because they don't have as much sugar in them. This would be great for a bright line eating friendly soup or a bake recipe. Sometimes people like to make a bake with all the things in their meal for easy travel, and that's it. So how I package this up is I portion it out to the size of a can of pumpkin, because often recipes call for a can or a half a can. So I figured out 796 mLs, 796 grams, and that's about 28.1 ounces. So I just weighed that out into each of these containers so that I have 1 can of pumpkin per container. Kid you not, my 2 pumpkins came to exactly 5 cans worth of pumpkin.
Squash. And that is how you'll squash your squash. Stay tuned next time for something else.